Hi, Aqua Roomers. It's time for chapter reading. Oh boy, things are really getting exciting. And if you remember, our last chapter, Pa has started to dig a well. He doesn't want to have to always go to the creek to get water for everything. Look how deep he is. Wow. I can't imagine digging a hole that deep. And if you remember, he went to get his friend and neighbor, Mr. Scott, to help. They decided they would trade work. First, Mr. Scott would help Pa dig the well. And then, after that, Pa would help Mr. Scott dig a well. Laura and Mary had not seen Mr. or Mrs. Scott. Their house was hidden somewhere in a little valley on the prairie. Laura had seen the smoke rising up from it, and that was all. At sunup the next morning, Mr. Scott came. He was short and stout. His hair was bleached by the sun, and his skin was bright red and scaly. He did not tan, he peeled. "It's the blasted sun and wind," he said. "Beg your pardon, ma'am, but it's enough to make a saint use strong language. I might as well be a snake, the way I keep on shedding my skin in this country." Laura liked him. Every morning, as soon as the dishes were washed and the beds made, she ran out to watch Mr. Scott and Pa working at the well. The sunshine was blistering, even the winds were hot, and the prairie grasses were turning yellow. Mary preferred to stay in the house and sew on her patchwork quilt, but Laura liked the fierce light and the sun and the wind, and she couldn't stay away from the well, but she was not allowed to go near its edge. Pa and Mr. Scott had made a stout windlass. It stood over the well, and 2 buckets hung from it on the ends of a rope. When the windlass was turned, 1 bucket went down into the well, and the other bucket came up. In the morning, Mr. Scott slid down the rope and dug. He filled the buckets with earth almost as fast as Pa could haul them up and empty them. Then after dinner, Pa slid down the rope into the well, and Mr. Scott hauled up the buckets. Every morning, before Pa would let Mr. Scott go down the rope, he set a candle in a bucket and lighted it and lowered it to the bottom. He lit a candle, put it all the way down to the bottom. Once Laura peeped over the edge, and she saw the candle brightly burning far down in the dark hole in the ground. And then Pa would say, "Seems to be all right," and he would pull up the bucket and blow out the candle. "Oh, that's all foolishness, Ingalls," Mr. Scott said. "The well was all right yesterday." "You can never tell," Pa replied. "Better be safe than sorry." Laura did not know what danger Pa was looking for by that candlelight. She did not ask, because Pa and Mr. Scott were busy. She meant to ask later, but she forgot. One morning, Mr. Scott came while Pa was eating breakfast. They heard him shout, "Hi, Ingalls! It's sunup, let's go!" Pa drank his coffee and went out. The windlass began to creak, and Pa began to whistle. Laura and Mary were washing the dishes, and Ma was making the big bed when Pa's whistle stopped. They heard him say, "Scott!" He shouted, "Scott! Scott!" And then he called, "Caroline, come quick!" Ma ran out of the house. Laura ran after her. "Scott's fainted or something down there," Pa said. "I've got to go down after him." And before I read the next part, I want to show you a picture of what it looks like. So there's Mr. Scott, and there's Pa. And do you see how there's two ropes? So when they turn the crank, one rope goes down and the other rope comes up. Just like that. But oh boy, this is a little scary. Ma ran out of the house. Laura ran after her. Scott's fainted or something down there, Pa said. I've got to go down after him. Did you send down the candle? Ma asked. No. I thought he had. I asked him if it was all right, and he said it was. Pa cut the empty bucket off the rope and tied the rope firmly to the windlass. Charles, you can't. You mustn't, Pa said. Caroline, I've got to. You can't, Charles. No. I'll make it all right. I won't breathe till I get out. We can't let him die down there. Ma said fiercely. Laura, keep back. So Laura kept back. She stood against the house and she shivered. No, Charles, I can't let you, Ma said. Get on Patty. Go for help. There isn't time. Charles, if I can't pull you up, if you keel over down there and I can't pull you up. Caroline, I've got to, Pa said. He swung into the well. His head slid out of sight, down the rope. Ma crouched and shaded her eyes, staring down into the well. Over the prairie, meadowlarks were rising, singing, flying straight up into the sky. The wind was blowing warmer, but Laura was cold. Suddenly, Ma jumped up, seized the handle of the windlass. She tugged at it with all her might. The rope strained, and the windlass creaked. Laura thought that Pa had keeled over down in the dark bottom of the well, and Ma couldn't pull him up. But the windlass turned a little, and then a little more. Pa's hand came up, holding onto the rope. His other hand reached above it, took hold of the rope, then Pa's head came up. His arm held onto the windlass. And then somehow he got to the ground and sat there. The windlass whirled round and round, and there was a deep thud down in the well. Pa struggled to get up, and Ma said, Sit, Charles. Laura, get some water, quick. Laura ran. She came hurrying back, lugging the pail of water. Pa and Ma were both turning the windlass, turning. The rope slowly wound itself up, and the bucket came up out of the well and tied to the bucket, and the rope was Mr. Scott. His arms and legs and his head hung and wobbled. His mouth was partly open, and his eyes were half shut. Look at that. It took two of them. Pa went down into the well. He had to cut the rope. He tied Mr. Scott to the rope. Somehow, Pa was able to get out of the big hole out of the well, and there he and Ma, cranking and pulling the windlass to get Mr. Scott out of the well. What happened? Let's read. Whew. Pa tugged him onto the grass. Pa rolled him over, flopped where he was rolled. Pa felt his wrist, listened to his chest, and then Pa lay down beside him. He's breathing, Pa said. He'll be all right. In the air. I'm all right, Caroline. I'm plumb tuckered out is all. Well, Ma said, I should think you would be. Of all the senseless performances, my goodness gracious, scaring a body to death, all for a want of a little reasonable care. My goodness, And then Ma covered her face with her apron, and she burst out crying. That was a terrible day. I don't want a well, Ma sobbed. It isn't worth it. I won't have you running such risks. Mr. Scott had breathed a kind of gas that stays deep in the ground. It stays at the bottom of wells because it is heavier than the air. It cannot be seen, cannot be smelled, but no one can breathe it very long and live. Pa had gone down into that gas to tie Mr. Scott to the rope so that he could be pulled up out of the gas. When Mr. Scott was able, he went home. And before he went, he said to Pa, "You were right about that candle business, Ingalls. I thought it was all foolishness, and I would not bother with it. But I found out my mistake." "Well," Pa said, "where a light can't live, I know I can't. And I like to be safe when I can be, but all's well that ends well." And I have a picture to show you and a little story to tell you. So this is about the light that goes down into the well. This is true. This is my grandfather. And this painting of him was done in 1907. But I want you to look carefully at his head when he was a little boy. He has a cap, but look at this. That is a candle. It's a light on the top. Because he and his father worked in the mines. And like wells, mines are deep down in the ground. You know what the miners had to do? Just like Pa did with the candle, they wore a light on top of their hats, on their caps. And when they were under the ground, if that candle went out, whoo, they knew they'd better leave the mine, better get out and come out into the fresh air. And that's how they knew to be safe. So, that's the story of my grandfather. I hope you like that painting. I sure do. So, back to our story. Pa rested a while. He breathed a little of the gas, and he felt like resting. But that afternoon, he raveled a thread from a sack. He took a little powder from his powder horn. He tied the powder into a piece of cloth with one end of the string in the powder. "Come along, Laura," he said. "I'll show you something." They went to the well. Pa lighted the end of the string and waited till the spark was crawling along it. Then he dropped the bundle into the well. In a minute, they heard a muffled bang, and a puff of smoke came out of the well. "That will bring the gas," Pa said. When the smoke was all gone, he let Laura light the candle and stand beside him while he let it down. All the way down in the dark hole, the little candle kept on burning like a star. So next day, Pa and Ma and Mr. Scott went on digging the well, but they always sent the candle down every morning. Isn't that exciting? I'm so glad I could share a story about my grandfather. And I hope that was exciting. We learned something new today, didn't we? Okay. Thank you, Aqua Roomers. Until tomorrow. Bye.